So yeah, so I come at AI as a somebody that highly values education and who deeply is deeply concerned about the preparation of our graduates from A&M for excellence in the professional world. At least at the point that I get them. So, I do teach large core courses, as well as some other things for political science. And so I see a lot of students. And my concerns that I ran into from fall of 2013 when I first started teaching have not dissipated at all. I'm afraid. I've just been able to sort of create more more resources and change the way that I teach in order to try and contribute to the solution rather than to the problem. Okay, full screen now. Excellent. Very good. Very good. So as you can see, I'm coming at this from a concern perspective. I understand that that's not where everybody is at, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. I can see both sides, but given where I stand, I feel like I need to sort of take one position, and we can go from there. So the reason why I care is, I'm a graduate of this place. I graduated in '84. And grades here were not all great. I had scholarships that I had to maintain, and so I was able to keep mostly A's and B's. But I ran into a place during my second semester of junior year, which is a terrible place to discover this, when I just realized that I had not built enough understanding. I'd just been sort of working the system enough to be able to get good grades that I couldn't actually understand a junior, a upper level physics course. And so that was sort of a reckoning for me, and I needed to make some adjustments and enter an academic advisor, and a unexpected miracle, and I was able to graduate on time, but also with a minor in psychology, which was wonderful. That's actually probably been more useful in many ways than my physics undergrad. So then I commissioned straight into the Air Force, and I ended up being there for 26 years. And integrity is really important there as well. So we talk about integrity first as being one of our core values, and so those kinds of things matter. I also was able to, as I worked with people who were across the board wonderful, but and then as I began to supervise people, it became very clear to me who were the good learners and who weren't, and the impact that made in the professional world and on the mission. And so that was a concern. Although at the same time, I also learned wonderful skills there, such as how to write multiple choice questions that measure understanding as opposed to familiarity. Because when you're trying to give a pretest to somebody before you toss them in the simulator to see if they're qualified to be a planner analyst or a mission controller on console for a $100 million satellite system, it matters. And so when I ran into the question during my first fall course back in 2013, I realized like 2 weeks into the course, oh, gee, I got to write an exam. And then I said, oh, I know how to do that. So that ended up being good. At the same time, my wife, Kathy, and I were building a family, a couple of bio kids in there. The rest are adopted. And actually, there's sort of a 8.5. We actually went past the rule a little bit because we have full custody of a grandchild. So we're raising a second set of kids right now. But you start looking at integrity, and you start looking at learning. And when you're a parent, it's a whole new perspective, and it takes on a new degree of importance, priority. A couple of those kids are also former students from here, so I have that perspective as well. And so there they all are. There's one partner's ring in there, so that's why there's 4. And then came back here. The Air Force sent me back here for a PhD. And so had 3 years to do it. That's just the military way of sending officers off to get PhDs. And got A's in all my seminars, put in a ton of work, but got that, and then flunked one of my comprehensive exams. And so that was another learning point about in multiple ways, but I was able to graduate and with time, I've continued to realize the value of all of that blood, sweat, and tears of those 3 years. It certainly enables me to be here and to be teaching, which is what I love to do. I'm very, very, very lucky to be able to say that I have a second career that I enjoy as much, if not more, than my first one. And then today, as I said, been teaching for 10 years and 1,500 students this semester. So the new ILCB large arena enables all kinds of wonderful increases in numbers, and lecturers get paid by sections, not by students. So it's been an interesting combination, a lot of work, but also a lot of opportunity. So the need is great, and I'm glad to try and stand in the gap along with all the rest of you. So that ends up being about 2.5% of the undergraduate student body in this semester. And so I walk along campus and I go, okay, which 2.5 students are, of every 100 are the ones that are in my class? Some of them want to say hello and some of them don't. So about 20,000 students overall. And I've also got the additional perspective of 7 years on the Honor Council, which is very pertinent to the AI issue as well. So let's do a poll, okay? I'm a ChatGPT fan, and so if ChatGPT is to ChatGPT is to academics as blank is to blank is what I would like for you to play around with. So one of the ones that we ran across early on in when all the articles started coming out in the spring about ChatGPT and academics, one of the ones that came out was people making the comparison that, hey, ChatGPT is to writing as calculators are to math. And everybody was up in arms about calculators. In fact, I had to convince my dad to allow me to buy a very early edition of TI 30s back when I was in chemistry, because they switched from slide rules to calculators that semester. So as an assistant is to users, good. And so so some people just say, hey, we'll get over it. It's going to be great. It's going to be fine. There's no problem. As cell phone is to my grandmother, probably. I'm going to guess that grandmother goes along with the my. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I get that feeling. Absolutely. Especially when my students tell me how they built a prompt, I'm going, oh my goodness, I never even thought about doing that as processor is to writing. Okay, good. So let me make a point though about some of these. It's similar to what you've got here. This calculator is to math. My concern here is that ChatGPT is actually, in my mind, not like a calculator is to math, or like a word processor is to composition, okay? Because it's not just a tool, it actually emulates knowledge. And, so if I had a calculator where I could just type in the word problem and it would spit it out, I didn't have to worry about trying to conceptualize the problem, set up an approach to be able to solve it, then that would be one hunkin' great calculator. And I think the level of concerns might be a lot bigger, because one of the things that people say about calculators and math is, hey, it's just the numbers. You still have to know all this stuff in advance, okay, in order to be able to use the calculator to get the proper answer. And so I think it's something that's worth considering and continuing to think about. Okay, let's see. Internet is to writing. Yep. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so I will tip my hat to artificial intelligence. I actually was, the Air Force sent me for a master's degree in 91, 92 at the Air Force Institute of Technology up in Ohio. And one of my courses was actually on neural networks, which were very in their infancy at that point in time. And I was just amazed at what the capabilities of neural networks were. And of course, that's the technology that goes behind generative AI. And so, trying to mechanically and electronically emulate some of the processing, the way that we think, the way that our brain works with respect to the different neurons and the sort of single task focus that each neuron often has, and then the learning process and the training process that goes along with all that. So, of course, AI has been around for a long time. I mean, how many of us can remember Deep Blue, beating, the AI, the chess champion of the world, IBM supercomputer. And there's been lots and lots of things. I was really shocked back in February or March after starting to come up to speed a little bit on this long language model, AI that had been introduced to the world November of last year, at least to the consumers of the world, was that legal offices have been using a tailored generative AI system for at least 2 or 3 years. Okay. That had been just for them, and nobody had been talking about it, but they've been using it. And so, this is certainly going to be something that's already big in business and is going to continue to be so. So, while OpenAI sort of caught all of us by surprise, it's very interesting to sort of lift the hood, and there's some really good sort of basic explanations out there about how large language models work, and it's fascinating. You talk about, it's not just a next word predictor, it's actually doing this in a vector space of like 1,000+ dimensions. Okay. And so it's not just calculating the shortest distance to in a particular direction to a possible word, but it's doing this thousands of times over. And it's really quite fascinating when you get a chance to sort of read a layman's explanation. And so, the capabilities are wonderful. And the fact that regular consumers, at least for right now, have access to them without a paywall, at least in some cases, although it's been predicted that that's going to become, less and less so perhaps, but, Google's moving it into their suites, Microsoft's moving it into their suites. We'll have to see, but I'm sure it will be a long and glorious ride on the part of generative AI. So, this bodes the question of, since we're here preparing people to enter into the professional world, shouldn't we be preparing them to use AI? Shouldn't AI be part of the toolbox that we're using to help them prepare, so that they can perform at the level that they're expected to perform using the AI that is going to be similar, at least somewhat, to the AI that they will be using? And so I think that's a really pertinent point. And I think for some instructors, the right answer is going to be, of course, I need to buy into this fully, and we need to work on helping students understand how to exploit, how to fully maximize the benefit of these tools. But I also realized that there's some realities when it comes to actual student learning, not just performance in the business world and getting to the right answer. The question is about getting to the right answer. What is it that we're losing? And that, that's the classic calculator question to a degree, right? What is it that we're losing? Well, people can no longer do mental math quite often because they just turn to a calculator. And one of the answers used to be years ago was, you're not always going to have a calculator with you, so you need to be able to do it. Of course, now we have calculators on our phone, on our computers, on our watches. They're just about everywhere. And yet at the same time, I and my kids are very, very thankful that we can do mental math, and so that's certainly a powerful thing to be able to bring to the mix. So as I mentioned earlier, AI, generative AI, these large language models, has the ability of being able to create the illusion of knowledge. And that's really the core of my concern, is that it produces something that somebody else can claim is their own knowledge when it's actually probably not. And so my definition of knowledge and of understanding is, you need to be able to explain in your own words what it is that you know to somebody else. You need to be able to teach back what it is that you've been taught. And if AI is doing that teaching back, then I have no ability to assess what it is the student has actually learned. So when we think about it, AI-generated responses, ideas, text are actually fabricated, right? Because there's nothing new out there. They're just taking pieces and bits of what is already out there in its training data set, the World Wide Web, for example, and then putting them together in a way that it considers to make the most sense based upon its training and based upon the request. Of course, it's also can be plagiarism. I've run into that last spring and this summer, because students get really smart and they say, okay, I want my answer to come from this website. And so they'll put the prompt in saying, okay, answer this question based upon this website, boom. One of the things that happens then is AI becomes a the AI bot becomes a paraphraser. And it's just like running it through Quillbot or something else, where it just rearranges words or picks synonyms. Quite often doesn't. It keeps phrases together, but sometimes it'll move the phrase from the beginning to the end. And it's really, you can pick it up pretty quickly once you know what to look for. And it's plagiarism of ideas, if not of words. So if there's a assignment that requires student's own original work, without outside resources or with a limited set of outside resources that does not include AI, then that's cheating, right? If they do use AI. And Student Rule 20, says some things that sometimes we're not all familiar with. One of them is that, students are responsible for authenticating all work submitted. In other words, it's not on the faculty member or the instructor to say, okay, I have to be able to prove that you did this legitimately according to the instructions. No, the student needs to be able to do that. And so there's a whole nother set of things that we could talk about in the future about how to set up our students for success when it comes to that. Such as make sure if you're going to write a paper, write it in an app such as Google Docs, where it maintains a history. So if there's some question, you can say, here's my first draft, here's my second draft. Keep your notes. If you're taking notes while you're doing research, keep the notes. There's various things that can often be done in order to sort of prepare. Students need to be prepared to be able to authenticate. So there's also a recent change in Student Rule 20 just came in last month, and that is that they've rewritten the definitions for fabrication and falsification to try and make those more clear. And so the fabrication actually calls out artificial intelligence now. There's also some caveats that students need to be able to learn. And I think that this is really quite important. That AI isn't just all bells and whistles and gee, isn't this really cool, but it also brings in hidden dangers, things that we all probably are very familiar with. Information, just because it comes from a bot doesn't mean that it's right. The sources of the information may not be available at all, depending on which bot you're using. And even if it does provide some, they may be wrong. It's really easy to read something that comes out of a large language model and just go, oh, this is so cool. And you just sort of fawn over it. And you don't take the time to sort of check it, right, for accuracy or for problems, just because, it's written so eloquently. And then also in my mind, there's very few advantages to a large language model output that beat just a good internet search, okay? Because a lot of the caveats for a large language model output are actually, much more apparent, are sort of taken care of with a good internet search. What your sources were, you're able to curate those sources and pick the ones that you think are most accurate, for example, okay, both for quality of the output as well as the accuracy. Thanks. So another thing about Student Rule 20 when it comes to the honor code is that we get to set the rules. And the CTE syllabus, recommendations when it comes to AI, are really helpful. And they really point out the fact that, hey, it's up to us to do this. We can each make our own decision. And the students need to, become aware of the fact that just one instructor's decision doesn't hold sway over others. Another thing that's in Rule 20 that some instructors don't realize is that the only authorized sources for any assignment are those that the instructor has specifically authorized. It's a positive approach to this. And so students are not safe to make assumptions about anything when it comes to outside sources or additional resources that they could use. And so this is another place where we need to be training our students to ask those questions. And we also need to realize that the AI issue is a lot bigger than just ChatGPT, right? I mean, there's Bard, there's Llama, there's this, there's that. There's a lot of these large language model and artistic kinds of creative models that are out there now. But we've had Quillbot.com for a number of years now, which basically is a paraphraser. It doesn't get past the plagiarism problem at all because it still plagiarizes the idea. It just makes it a lot harder for plagiarism detectors to pick it up. Grammarly Premium, it's now capable of doing a lot of writing for the student. Instead of just correcting grammar errors, it will offer whole sentences or rearrange things in a paragraph, et cetera, which can be seen as very useful to some students who are weak in writing, especially those whose home languages are something other than English. But it also, is it's a hole that you can get sucked down into, and it's really difficult to sort of sometimes determine where it is okay to use and what's too much. Chegg was on its way out in the spring, and we were all applauding as ChatGPT, caused the users at the Chegg website to plummet, and then Chegg drunk the Kool-Aid for AI, and now they have Checkmate. So they are back with a roar. This is the CTE website, which is very helpful. Lots of good resources on there, including those syllabus language options. So those are there. So let me just take a quick poll here. So once again, using the same response. Let me see. Oh, there we go. I was advancing on the wrong screen there. So what is it you're feeling about the use of generative AI by students in your classroom? Based upon your responses earlier, I'm going to think there's a lot more on the green end than on the red end. But just, you can just touch your screen to pick. And let's see where you're at. So leaning good. That's where we're at right now. And once again, I think this is going to vary greatly depending upon what it is that you're teaching, what it is the material is that you're covering, how it is that you are approaching the education task that you have, and that's fine. Okay, good deal. Thank you. So my situation, though, is different. As I mentioned earlier, I teach a whole heck of a lot of students. And I work really hard to try and make sure that good quality learning is at least possible in these very large settings. And that means that, most of my assessments are going to be multiple choice, which, are not usually open to AI kinds of assistance. But I do use discussion board posts and other kinds of things, and that's where I've run into problems in the recent past. And it's not just trying to get them to learn the answers. I always tell them high school, it's about who, what, when, and where. In college, it's who, what, when, and where, but also how and why. And so that's really the crux of the matter if you're going to become an expert about some information. And then also things like learning to be curious. Okay. If AI is doing all of your creative thinking for you, then you're not learning how to do that, on your own necessarily. It can be a prompt to where you can sort of go, oh, gee, never thought about that way before. Now that's going to change the way I think about this in the future. But if it becomes a crutch, then it can be a problem. So as I have sort of described to you, I'm an admirer, but not a fanboy. I find that it's not helpful in at least the learning tasks that I'm asking my students to undertake, and the changes that I'm expecting them to make, moving from a high school learner to becoming an accomplished adult learner. And then I also find that it's not fair. Okay, and I've ran into that repeatedly. So I make it real clear in the documents that I provide for my students. I divide AI into 3 different types: chat AI, writing assistance AI, and answer lookup AI. And so all of that is there. Answer lookup AI, we haven't really seen yet, but it's sort of on the edge. There's going to be, if not already, there's going to be an overlay, a add-in that you can put in your browser. And when a screen pops up that has questions, maybe even multiple choice questions on it, it's going to automatically search a database to see if it knows that question and what the answer is. So this is coming. So I care a whole heck of a lot about this. My course orientation is actually 2 days long, and my second day is all about academic success. And I really work on over communicating in my classroom just because it's so big. It's really easy for students to tune it out. I have so many fish that they're drinking from a fire hose and drowning quite often, and everybody's telling them something different, and it's difficult for them to remember if they want to, and sometimes they're just to that point where they are past the point of being able to care. So I also am very transparent about past academic misconduct. I've had a lot in my course. That's the reason I joined the Honor Council, is because I was sending them so many cases that I felt I had to do, pay my dues there. And so there's really a great AI video that CTE put out. The link is there, and it asks some really important questions. And this is one that I have not even added into my course yet, and so I need to do that. That's going to become part of a upcoming homework to make sure that students get exposed to this.
Hey, Dwight, before you jump in, I'm just curious, because I know you've been on Honor Council a long time, and I know it was in response to what was going on in your class. Are you seeing that these course interventions of, taking that second day of class to go through academic success and academic integrity is having an impact, that you're seeing fewer instances?
You sound like my dissertation advisor. I would always talk to him about what I'm doing. He says, yeah, but what's your measure? How do you know that there's, any impact? Well, one thing, I feel less guilty. I feel like I'm doing more on my side to try. And yes, it's really hard to assess, but I can tell you that I've had multiple anecdotal instances of students coming back to me, not only during the class or after my class, but even before graduation, years after they've had my class, and say that, I made all the difference for them, that they really learned how to be able to appreciate and to maximize the usefulness of, university education to them. And so it's sort of like it's my starfish story, right? So the grandson's walking with his grandfather along the beach. There's been a big storm the night before, and the beach is littered with starfish that have been tossed up onto the sand, certain to die. The sun is coming up. They're starting to rise as they're beginning to dry out. And the grandfather pays no attention to them, okay? But the grandson, pretty regularly, as they're walking along chatting, reaches down, picks up a starfish, and throws it back into the ocean. Grandfather says, so why are you doing that? Look in front of us, look behind us. There are millions of these starfish. Why are you doing this? And he said, it doesn't matter, right? And the grandchild picked up another one, tossed it back in the ocean, and says, it mattered to that one. And so that's my attitude when it comes to this. It's not just the second day. It's what I've found is that you have to continue. I mean, you can never drop the topic, right? You have to continue bringing it back up and reminding them and tossing new versions of this out. And it's a whole attempt to try and encapsulate them in opportunities to be able to do this, because it's just so important. Okay, so let me wrap this up pretty quickly here. These are just some of the resources that I put. One of the things I do in my Canvas course is that I have a module 1A that is just packed with resources that I've written. And so this is one that drills down into that question about authorized and unauthorized resources, just because it's often one that students don't really think about, because they sort of go, oh, well, this must be okay, or it was okay in this course, so it must be okay over there, or I used it in high school, so it must be okay here. All kinds of assumptions are made. And so this is at least an opportunity for us to set the record straight with respect to that. I also break out one into AI and talk about, hey, I'm not an AI hater, but here's the issues. And I talk about a lot of the things that I've talked with you about already. And then I boil it all down into a quick reference table. Down there along the rows are all my different assignments, my graded assignments or ungraded assignments in the course. And then I break it out and sort of say, okay, let's get down to the nitty gritty. So, the STEM folks really appreciate this. The history majors maybe less so, and that's fine. There's going to be different strokes for different folks. Then within the instructions for various activities, I once again hit the hammer, hit the nail on the head with respect to not just expecting that they remember what I told them from someplace else, but bringing it home again. Especially because PackBack has been a problem lately with respect to AI. PackBack is my discussion board tool that I use, which is more than just a discussion board. It's pretty cool. So, I've got plenty of war stories. I just sanctioned over 40 students at the end of the spring semester for PackBack posts that were mostly written by AI, sometimes just blatant plagiarism, sometimes a combination of the two. And so we can talk about those in Q&A if you're interested. And, I read a lot. So Wendy and I are always sending articles back and forth about stuff that we find on AI and its impact on education, either positive or negative. And so, if you'd like to chat about any of this at any point in time, past today, I'm more than happy to do so. My concerns about AI are more than just about the academic applications, and so we could chat there too. Okay. So that's me. And Cindy, there you go. There's your plug for next week before we do Q&A.